The fall of Imperial Russia. Russia, once a vast empire stretching across a sixth of the Earth's surface, seemed unshakable under the rule of Tsar Nicholas II. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming fast. The Tsar held absolute power over a diverse and struggling population, most of whom lived in poverty, working as peasants or low-wage laborers. While Nicholas lived in luxury in the Winter Palace, his people suffered and tensions grew. Calls for reform echoed through the empire, fueled by lack of civil rights, poor working conditions, and a rigid, outdated government. In 1904, the Russo-Japanese War became a turning point. Aimed at expanding Russian influence in East Asia, the war ended in a crushing and unexpected defeat. Japan's modern military overwhelmed the Russian forces, revealing deep flaws in Russia's army and leadership. Back home, morale plummeted, resources dwindled, and the people's frustration intensified. The situation exploded in 1905 during Bloody Sunday, when peaceful protesters approaching the Winter Palace were gunned down by imperial troops. The massacre destroyed the image of the Tsar as a benevolent father and triggered mass strikes, riots, and uprisings. To calm the chaos, Nicholas II created the Duma, a legislative body, but its power was limited and real control remained in the Tsar's hands. It was too little too late. Nicholas II tried to regain control by taking command of the army himself, leaving Alexandra and Rasputin in charge of the capital. But his absence only tied him to the army's failures, while political chaos in Petrograd worsened. The 1917 revolutions and civil war. In early 1917, Russia stood on the brink of collapse. Years of war, hunger, and inequality pushed the people to revolt. What became known as the February Revolution, March in the Gregorian calendar, began with bread riots and worker strikes in Petrograd. Soldiers ordered to suppress the crowds joined them instead, raising red flags and defying the Tsar. Tsar Nicholas II, isolated and unaware of the uprising's scale, ordered a military response. But by the time he grasped the reality that even his army had turned, it was too late. On March 15th, from a railcar far from the capital, he abdicated, ending over 300 years of Romanov rule. Power passed to a provisional government, formed from members of the Duma. Liberal in outlook, they promised reforms, civil liberties, and elections. But they refused to enact radical changes, like land redistribution, and insisted on continuing Russia's disastrous involvement in World War I. Meanwhile, grassroots councils called Soviets, made up of workers and soldiers, emerged as powerful counterforces, especially the influential Petrograd Soviet. Russia entered a period of dual power, where both groups clashed over the nation's future. Into this chaos returned Vladimir Lenin, sent by Germany in a sealed train to sow instability. Arriving in April, he issued his April Theses, demanding peace, land, and bread, and calling for all power to the Soviets. His radical vision gained traction among the disillusioned masses. The Russian Civil War. Though the Bolsheviks now ruled Petrograd, the rest of Russia resisted. A loose alliance known as the White Army, made up of monarchists, liberals, nationalists, and foreign-supported forces, rose to fight the Bolsheviks, who formed the Red Army, led by Leon Trotsky. Trotsky quickly turned the Red Army into a formidable force. Political commissars enforced loyalty, and deserters faced harsh punishment. The Red Army controlled central Russia with its railways, factories, and cities, while the Whites, scattered across the fringes, struggled with internal divisions and lack of coordination. From 1918 to 1922, the war raged with shifting alliances and brutal tactics. Atrocities were committed by both sides: executions, looting, and massacres. Foreign powers like Britain, France, the U.S., and Japan sent troops and aid to the Whites, hoping to stop communism. But their involvement was half-hearted and often counterproductive. Many Russians saw it as foreign interference, which strengthened Bolshevik propaganda and support. The Bolsheviks framed their cause as a fight for the working class, promising equality and land redistribution. By 1920, The Reds had largely crushed the Whites, reclaiming lost territories and suppressing rebellions. Though the Red victory established the Soviet Union, it came at a heavy cost. Millions of lives lost, a shattered economy, and deep political divisions. The dream of a workers' paradise would soon be tested under a new, far more centralized power. Stalin's rise to power. After Lenin's death in January 1924, the Soviet Union was plunged into a fierce power struggle. With no clear succession plan and Lenin's legacy casting a long shadow, the stakes were immense. Among the key Bolshevik leaders vying for control were Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and an emerging figure, Joseph Stalin. Trotsky, a brilliant orator and hero of the Civil War, seemed the natural successor. Charismatic and respected, he was also polarizing, often criticized for his arrogance. In contrast, Stalin appeared modest and practical, a quiet worker rather than a revolutionary star. But beneath that image, Stalin was executing a calculated plan. As General Secretary of the Communist Party, Stalin controlled appointments across the vast Soviet bureaucracy. What seemed like a routine administrative role was, in fact, a strategic position that allowed him to fill the party with loyalists. Quietly and systematically, he built a power base from within. Stalin also positioned himself as Lenin's true disciple, emphasizing his loyalty while subtly undermining Trotsky, portraying him as elitist and disconnected from the common worker. Aligning first with Zinoviev and Kamenev, Stalin marginalized Trotsky, accusing him of betraying Lenin's ideals. Trotsky's own mistakes, including missing Lenin's funeral, gave Stalin the upper hand in shaping public perception. With absolute power, he abandoned Lenin's new economic policy in favor of forced industrialization and centralized planning. He envisioned a powerful Soviet state, independent of capitalist influence and capable of global dominance. But this vision came at a devastating cost. Stalin tightened his grip on every aspect of Soviet life. The secret police, GPU, later NKVD, enforced loyalty through widespread surveillance, arrests, and executions. Fear became a tool of governance. Dissent, real or imagined, was met with brutal repression. The cult of personality began to take shape. Stalin was elevated to near-mythical status. Propaganda portrayed him as wise, heroic, and inseparable from the destiny of the USSR. Images, textbooks, and films celebrated him while purging all memory of those he had removed. Even owning a photo with a disappeared figure could lead to arrest. Stalin didn't just eliminate his enemies, he erased them from history. In the late 1920s, Stalin initiated collectivization, a sweeping policy that reshaped rural life and launched the USSR into a new era, one defined by transformation, fear, and the consolidation of power under one man, Joseph Stalin. Industrialization and the five-year plans. In 1928, Joseph Stalin launched the first five-year plan, initiating one of the most ambitious economic transformations in history. The Soviet Union, still recovering from civil war, revolution, and famine, would be reshaped into a powerful, self-sufficient industrial state, free from foreign capitalist influence and capable of competing with the world's strongest economies. The plan prioritized heavy industry, steel, coal, oil, and machinery. Consumer goods and public welfare were secondary, seen as sacrifices in the march toward industrial greatness. Every sector was governed by centrally imposed production quotas, with the state seeking complete control over economic life. But meeting these targets proved incredibly difficult. The quotas were not just ambitious, they were often unrealistically high. Factories were expected to double or even triple output overnight, whether they had the tools, workers, or materials to do so or not. Still, officials reported fabricated successes to maintain the illusion of progress. Massive infrastructure projects became symbols of Soviet determination. Entire industrial cities, such as Magnitogorsk, rose from barren land in record time. Built with a mix of ambition, labor, and often coercion, Magnitogorsk stood as a model of Stalin's industrial vision. Ironically, American engineers, many with experience from Ford Motor Factories, were secretly hired to design key elements of these projects, despite Soviet propaganda about total independence from the West. Despite the human suffering, the Soviet Union made undeniable industrial strides. By the end of the first five-year plan, steel production had risen by nearly 40%, and rural areas were being electrified. The USSR was manufacturing its own tractors, tools, and military equipment. An astonishing feat considering that most capitalist economies were crippled by the Great Depression during the same period. Propaganda glorified these achievements. Workers were hailed as heroes. One miner, Alexei Stakhanov, became a national legend for allegedly extracting 14 times his daily coal quota in a single shift. Whether true or exaggerated, his story inspired this Stakhanovite movement, encouraging workers to exceed targets in devotion to the state. However, industrial progress brought serious social consequences. Urban populations exploded as millions left the countryside in search of factory work. Cities quickly became overcrowded. Housing shortages were severe. Families squeezed into cramped communal apartments or temporary barracks. Basic services like clean water, sanitation, and healthcare lagged behind the population boom. Meanwhile, food remained scarce. Grain was prioritized for feeding urban workers, leaving many families dependent on meager rations. Hunger remained widespread, especially in rural areas devastated by Stalin's separate collectivization policies. The Soviet war effort. In 1941, the Soviet Union faced a fight for survival. The initial months of Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's invasion, left the Red Army devastated. Entire divisions were destroyed, and key industrial regions in the West fell into German hands. The Soviet leadership under Joseph Stalin scrambled to respond. In a desperate but strategic move, the USSR began relocating entire industries thousands of kilometers east beyond the Ural Mountains to protect them from German air raids. Factories, equipment, and workers were loaded onto trains and moved across the country. Miraculously, within months, production resumed deep in the Soviet interior, supplying tanks, artillery, and ammunition to the front lines. The Red Army, meanwhile, underwent rapid reorganization. Morale was at an all-time low after continuous defeats. In response, Stalin issued Order No. 227, famously known as Not One Step Back. This decree forbade retreat, with blocking units stationed behind front lines to prevent desertion, sometimes with deadly force. Penal battalions, made up of political prisoners and convicts, were assigned the most dangerous missions. These brutal measures were intended to harden Soviet resolve. By late 1942, the momentum shifted with the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest battles in history. Urban warfare raged for months, with buildings destroyed and gains measured in feet. Under General Georgy Zhukov, Soviet forces encircled the German Sixth Army, cutting off supplies and forcing surrender in early 1943. This victory marked a turning point in the war, signaling that the Red Army was regaining strength and morale. At its industrial peak, the Soviet Union surpassed Germany in key production areas, especially in tanks. The T-34, praised for its efficiency and rugged design, became the backbone of Soviet armored forces. Meanwhile, Soviet partisans behind enemy lines sabotaged railways, disrupted supply chains, and forced the Germans to divert resources, further weakening their positions. By 1945, the Red Army had transformed into a dominant force. Advancing through Eastern Europe, they stormed Berlin in April and raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, one of the most iconic images of World War II. But victory came at a staggering cost. More than 27 million Soviet soldiers and civilians lost their lives, the highest death toll of any nation in the war. Even in the darkest moments, Soviet ingenuity never waned. The Night Witches, with their eerie, silent bombing runs, struck fear into enemy hearts, earning their ghostly nickname from terrified German soldiers. Their tactics embodied the spirit of Soviet resistance: resourceful, unrelenting and deeply committed to victory. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union emerged victorious but scarred. Its people had endured unimaginable suffering. Yet their sacrifice and resilience had saved their nation and forever changed the course of history. Legacy of the Soviet Union. The legacy of the Soviet Union is one of deep contradictions, an extraordinary chapter in history marked by both groundbreaking achievements and tragic consequences. For nearly 70 years, the USSR reshaped the global order, transforming a largely agrarian Russian empire into a nuclear-armed superpower. It became a symbol of industrial might, scientific innovation, and ideological ambition, but also a cautionary tale of authoritarianism, repression, and the devastating human cost of centralized power. Through collectivization, forced labor, famine, and brutal purges, millions suffered under the weight of Stalinist policies. Freedom of speech, movement, and religion were suppressed by a regime that prioritized control above all else. Yet, even amid such oppression, the Soviet Union left behind enduring contributions to global progress. In science and technology, the USSR stunned the world. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 marked the dawn of the space age, as the Soviet Union became the first nation to send a satellite into orbit. This achievement ignited the space race, with Soviet cosmonauts like Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space, becoming global icons. Later advancements, such as the Mir space station, laid the groundwork for international cooperation in space exploration. But these advancements coexisted with an oppressive political structure. The Soviet one-party system relied on surveillance, censorship, and a cult of personality to maintain control. Dissent was silenced, often brutally. The KGB monitored citizens' every move, and loyalty to the state was paramount. After the USSR's collapse, many in the former republics looked back with a mix of nostalgia and trauma. For some, it was an era of stability, guaranteed employment, and global prestige. For others, it was a time of fear, scarcity, and suffering. Public memorials, museums, and monuments across Eurasia serve as somber reminders of the Gulag system, the Great Purges, and the heavy toll of forced modernization. At its peak, the Soviet Union was the largest country in history, spanning 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. It was a nation built on towering ambition and rigid ideology. Its fall was not sudden, but the result of deep internal contradictions, the inability to reconcile innovation with repression and unity with individual freedom. The Soviet Union remains one of the most studied and debated powers of the 20th century, a legacy both awe-inspiring and cautionary, a monument to human achievement on one hand, and a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked power on the other.